What's up, everybody? Today we are talking about how I feel about the Stinger versus how I felt about the Charger and the differences in experience between the two vehicles. So I did somewhat of a review of the Charger a few weeks ago, a month and a half ago. I'll link that down below. Last week I actually posted my review of the Stinger, so I'll link that down below as well if you want to see a little more in depth. I didn't go super in depth with the Charger. I just didn't feel like it after all those years, but I went much more in depth with the Stinger. So we're going to compare the two vehicles today. We're going to talk about them physically, how they feel to drive, how they are to be in, how I feel about them in general, and I'll give you my thoughts on the Stinger versus the Charger, and almost really what I would rather have. We'll see how we end up wrapping up this video. So starting first off with the Charger, the biggest difference between the Charger and the Stinger really is, at first glance, obviously, is the size and the styling. Starting with the styling, the Charger was meant to be much more angry looking, much more aggressive looking, much more muscle car-y looking, and the Stinger was much more sporty and stylish and luxury looking, because the Charger was trying to be an old school muscle car, whereas the Stinger was looking to compete with, you know, the C-Class and the 3 Series and the Audi A4, S4 class, somewhere in there. Not quite taking on the full M's, RS's, and AMG's, but, you know, like the M Sport level for those. The higher trim, but not the highest trim. And so that started off with a difference in styling. Also kind of led to a difference in size. If you know old school muscle cars, you know that old school muscle cars were big vehicles, big loud V8s, whereas the sports sedans, they have different size classes, and the more nimble one, that 3 Series level of sports sedan, is where the Stinger sits. So that's a big reason why they're styled vastly differently and have vastly different sizes. The Charger's 198.4 inches long, 75 inches wide, and is 58.2 inches in height with 120.2 inch wheelbase, whereas the Stinger is 190.2 inches in length, so 8.2 inches shorter, 73.6 inches in width, so it's 1.4 inches less wide, and that actually does make more of a difference than you would think it would, and 55.1 inches in height, so 3.1 inches shorter, and has a 114.4 inch wheelbase, so a 5.6 inch shorter wheelbase. So it's a, you know, in terms of vehicles, that is a much smaller vehicle. It is 8 inches shorter. It is 2 inches less, 1.5 inches about less wide, and 3 inches shorter. So it is overall definitely a much smaller vehicle and has an almost 6 inch shorter wheelbase, just because it's overall a smaller vehicle. Also, something that's interesting, especially when we talk about how this drives, is that the Charger Scat Pack without the lowering springs I had on it, it has 4.6 inches of ground clearance, and the Stinger has 5.1 inches of ground clearance. And when you combine the longer wheelbase of the Charger with the less ground clearance, it makes it harder to get in and out of parking lots that have steep entrances, or steep, skinny speed bumps are more of an issue. And that's definitely a benefit of the Stinger's size, is it fits more on the roads around where I live in Asheville. It fits better into parking lots. There's less concern over speed bumps and speed humps, even if I hadn't lowered the Charger. Another big physical difference is the weight, where the Charger Scat Pack weighs about 4,400 pounds. The Stinger is about 4,023 pounds. So we're talking 377 pound difference in weight. That's a big difference, and you can definitely feel that when you drive. So you combine the size and the weight difference alone, and it's already a much sportier driving experience in the Stinger. And then on top of that, the performance levels, although the Charger has 485 horsepower versus 468 in the Stinger, which is 117 more horsepower for the Charger, and 475 foot-pounds of torque versus 376, so 99 more foot-pounds of torque in the Charger. With the extra 377 pounds, plus the Stinger being all-wheel drive versus rear-wheel drive on the Charger, the performance is near identical, with the Charger being officially listed at 4.5 seconds 0 to 60, the Stinger being officially listed at 4.7 seconds 0 to 60. Most people aren't going to feel that 0.2 seconds, but people were also, with the all-wheel drive Stinger GT2, were able to get down to 4.2 seconds tested, and the Charger was able to get about 4.3, 4.4. So depending on driver and conditions, all that, just about the same 0 to 60 performance. And so the Stinger is about just as quick. And so not only is it just as quick, it also handles way better. It's way more nimble, and the shorter wheelbase and smaller size do help with that. But the Charger had much more body roll to it. It wasn't as precise in the steering. It just was more clodding, whereas the Stinger is much more nimble, which is not only due to the less weight and the shorter wheelbase and the shorter overall dimensions, but there's also a difference in driving modes, where the Charger had a sport mode, and a regular driving mode, and a comfort mode. And in sport mode, it just changed how it opened the exhaust, where the exhausts were active in the other modes, and it changed some of the electronic controls in the throttle response, and just a little bit of engine tuning. No more power, but just the way the engine responds. Whereas the Stinger has the difference in response to the engine and pedal feel, but on top of that also has adaptive suspension, which sport mode really helps it handle better than the Charger. And so overall, the driving experience is like just as quick, and it handles better, and it's much more sporty. If you wanted a drag car, you could still argue the Stinger because it's got all-wheel drive, but the Charger feels like much more of a straight line drag car, whereas the Stinger definitely lives up to the sports sedan competition and is a much better steering and handling car. In terms of comfort, I think they're fairly equal in comfort overall. And once again, you can go into comfort mode in the Stinger in the driving mode, and it does soften up the suspension, and it is definitely more comfortable. And I have to harken back to within the first year of my ownership of the Charger to really pull that out, because with the springs, it wasn't comfortable at all. But if you've been on lowering springs, you know that. But the Charger also soaked up bumps very well, and some of that was contributed to its weight. And when you're cruising on the highway, I'd say the Charger and the Stinger are fairly the same level of comfort. I think they both hide your speed very well, so you do have to be careful. So I do think the driving experience in just everyday normal driving and on highways was actually fairly similar, although in interior comfort, it really depends on what your definition of an interior comfort is, because the materials overall in the Stinger are nicer. The leather's nicer, even the fake leathers and the plastics are nicer than they were in the Charger, which is unsurprising with your typical American cars, especially with a Fiat Chrysler product at that time, where they don't necessarily focus on the niceness of materials. For their performance cars, they're looking more at raw power and performance, whereas the Stinger is, more focused on performance while also providing a nice cabin to sit in. And so from that standpoint, this Stinger is more comfortable and better to sit in, and that's without even getting into the difference in features, which I'll get to. But where the Charger is more comfortable is it's a much larger cabin to be in, where the Stinger has 93.8 cubic feet of passenger volume, and the Charger has 104.7 feet of cubic feet of passenger volume. Now, obviously, a lot of that is due to the size. Like, I could not touch the other door panel in the Charger sitting in the driver's seat. I can in the Stinger. And one of the things that is also contributing to that is, this is hard to explain without experiencing, but the floor is like higher in the Stinger. If the seat is all the way on the floor and I'm sitting in the passenger seat, my knees are like almost up to my chest. They're like at the top of my stomach in the Stinger, whereas the Charger, the seat all the way on the floor, my knees were still, at a right angle, perpendicular to the floor. And where that really comes into play is if you have to ride in the backseat. The backseat of the Charger was huge, whereas it's definitely not as big in the Stinger because it is a smaller car. And something that would help with that is if the floor was lower, because somebody has to sit behind me because I like my seat at the lowest position. You can't put your feet under the seat, and when there's not as much leg room in the back, that definitely makes a difference. So from a room standpoint, the Charger definitely wins as a more comfortable place to be. But if you also want features as part of your luxury, the Stinger definitely wins out in that. And that's not completely the Scat Pack's fault. I had the base Scat Pack, whereas the Stinger, I have the GT2, which is the highest level trim of the Stinger, and it's have all the features. Like, I have heated and cooled seats and heating steering wheel. The Scat Pack had none of those. I have parking cameras, including 360. I only had a reverse camera in the Charger. Those are the main ones. There's an electronic parking brake in this. Sometimes I prefer the manual one in the Charger. Sometimes I prefer the electronic one here. I did think the center screen in the middle of the gauge cluster, which is a fair comparison because both had analog gauges and then a center screen. I thought the center screen was much better in the Stinger. It had, in the Charger, it had many more pages and many more features. From an overall infotainment standpoint, I think that the Stinger wins overall for infotainment, but the Charger had performance pages where you could really measure out performance, and the Stinger doesn't have that. You could measure out G-forces and different levels of power, and you could time 0 to 60s and 60 to 0s and lap times and all sorts of stuff in the Charger, and the Stinger doesn't have that because it's not as focused on performance as much as it is a good performing luxury car. But overall, I do think the infotainment is a better system. The screen looks nicer. It's a little more responsive in the Stinger. I didn't find that as much in the Charger. But the Charger also had better interior space for storage. It had bigger door pockets. It had a bigger glove compartment. It had a bigger center console. So if that matters, the Charger wins out there. But if sound matters, this wins because I didn't have the Beats audio package that you could get on the Charger, but I have the Harman Kardon sound system in the Stinger. That's most of the features, really, and there's also the heated rear seats, which, of course, the Charger didn't have. The other thing that does help with being less roomy in the car is having this sunroof up here does also make the Stinger feel more roomy because you get the sunlight coming in, and just having a sunroof, a moonroof, or the new glass roofs that like go opaque and clear is used by automakers to make cabins feel more spacious, and it definitely does that. And then speaking of space, the cargo space is much more in the Stinger because it's the liftback. We're not doing with the seats down, but with the seats up in both cars, like if you had 4 passengers going on a family road trip, the Stinger offers 23.3 cubic feet of cargo space, whereas the Charger only had 16.5 cubic feet of cargo space. And that 7-ish feet can make a big difference if you have 4 people trying to use this vehicle on a road trip. So from a day-to-day standpoint, I don't think there's much of a difference. From a road trip standpoint, there's much more creature comforts in the Stinger, but there's much more room in the Charger, and there's more cargo volume in the Stinger. So you have to decide features and cargo volume or just overall space. I think the Charger also had a little more comfortable seats from like a cushioning standpoint than the Stinger, but the Stinger's leather is probably more comfortable than the Charger's cloth. So that also makes a difference. And then, like I said, in performance driving, the real difference is in the handling more than anything, and just the smaller size, the better chassis dynamics, the adjustable suspension, all of that, and the shorter wheelbase lead to a more engaging driving experience in the Stinger. Both of them have 8-speed automatic transmission, torque converter automatic transmissions with paddle shifters. The ZF 8-speed from the Charger is commonly used across many brands, and so if you used one, the tuning might be slightly different, but you're used to that. I forget what the Korean brand is for the Stinger's 8-speed torque converter automatic. I'll put that on the screen somewhere. But I think they're pretty similar. I don't have the measured numbers, but in terms of shift feel and how quick and responsive the transmission feels, whether in full auto mode or manual mode, I think they're pretty similar. I don't think there's a huge difference there. So overall, I have no regrets getting rid of the Charger. I'm very much a fan of the Stinger. I do miss having a V8. I miss the way the V8 sounds. This twin turbo V6 sounds so muffled. And so I do miss the V8. I just love V8s. It's my favorite engine configuration. And I do miss the V8 sound, especially that iconic Hemi sound. And I wish that this V6 twin turbo sounded better. But other than that, I have no real regrets. I miss some of the memories that I made in the Charger, and the emotional aspect of owning that car still is sad to see it go. But just car for car, especially being smaller on some of the tight roads around Asheville, I really do prefer the Stinger, and I have absolutely no regrets. If you live in a more wide open area and you want the V8, definitely go the Charger, especially if you're not looking to do really spirited driving on back roads or roads like Tail of the Dragon, which I did take the Charger on and I haven't taken the Stinger on, and the Charger was still really fun. I imagine the Stinger will be even more fun. But if you're looking for a cruiser or just a straight line car and you love that V8, I would go with the Charger. Obviously go a little bit newer Charger, right? You know, they sold them into 2023-ish, maybe 2024. I'm blanking on that now. And this Stinger stopped selling after the 2023 model year. But so they end around the same range where there won't be a whole lot of differences. And so if you're looking for the more spirited driving or you want more features, because even the highest optioned Charger does not have near the features that the Stinger does, even in the later years. If you want more options, you want nicer materials, you want better handling, go Stinger. I have no regrets. I really love the Stinger. It puts a smile on my face every time I drive it, as much as I still do miss the Charger every day. But those are my thoughts on Charger versus Stinger. I might visit this topic again after I've owned the Stinger for a year. I'm definitely gonna do like a year ownership video in a year. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. Charger versus Stinger. Which one would you rather have? Have you experienced one or either or both? And what did you think of them? And please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you like car content. You want to see mine first. Being subscribed and notified is the best way to make sure you see it and see it first. But thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video. Have a good day. Bye.